Carmine, the third son of Duke Comolin, had been in a foul mood for the past week. While the recent broken engagement was part of the reason, what was really getting under his skin was Count Palacio. At the latest banquet, he tried to relieve his stress by antagonizing Count Palacio, only to end up publicly humiliated. Of course, it was entirely Carmine's fault. If he hadn't made inappropriate comments about the appearance of another noblewoman, the engagement talks would have gone smoothly. And if he hadn't provoked Count Palacio, he wouldn't have faced such disgrace. However, Carmine had completely forgotten that he had instigated the conflict. He only focused on the humiliation he had suffered, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. It was the first time in his life he had experienced such shame. After all, as the son of Duke Comolin, a cornerstone of the kingdom, he had never faced such humiliation before, and that moment had left a deep mark on his memory. For about 10 days, Carmine would often grind his teeth while recalling the event. As soon as he arrived at the Comolin estate, he spoke, as if making a decision. "Hey! Yes, young master. Where did that bastard say he was going?" The last I heard, Count Palacio had some business in Caliban. Without listening to the night finish, Carmine hurried into his room and opened a desk drawer. Inside were numerous crystal balls. He picked the one from the far right and immediately took out a magic stone from his pocket, bringing it close to the crystal ball. As the crystal began to glow brightly, time passed, and the light started to dim. "Well, if it isn't my friend Carmine." A voice came from the crystal. "I'll get straight to the point. I need your help." Carmine spoke while holding the magic crystal. You need help? With what?" "Count Palacio. He's probably on his way right now. I need you to deal with him." "Deal with him? You mean Count Palacio?" The person on the other end, confused by the situation, asked again. "You don't have to kill him. Just leave him half dead." There was a brief silence from the man in the crystal before he spoke. "Even so, that's a bit. I'll give you 5. "What?" "If you take care of him, I'll give you 5 more. You need them, don't you? To get stronger." "Huh?" The man in the crystal let out a dry laugh at Carmine's words. "Are you serious? You can get me 5 of those. If you get the job done properly, it's no problem." The man in the crystal remained silent for a moment. "You can do it, can't you?" "Huh?" Then, as if amused, the man chuckled. "My friend, you know me too well. You always know exactly how to get to me. Are you going to do it or not? All I have to do is take care of him, right?" "Yeah. As brutally as possible." "Wow, he must have really pissed you off to ask this much. Anyway, got it. I'll take care of it and contact you once it's done." With those words, the communication ended. The room fell silent, as if the conversation that just took place had never happened. But there was one difference. A sly grin spread across Carmine's face. Did he really think I'd let him off after publicly humiliating me? That was the only thought occupying his mind. Have we finally arrived? Looks like it. It had been about 2 weeks since Alone met Eliban, the protagonist of this world. Looking out at the capital city of Kurdum in the distance, Alone shifted his gaze to the back of the carriage. Various gifts were loaded there, all meant for Deus, the person they were about to meet. I'm exhausted," yawned Evan from beside him, clearly tired as he glanced at the gifts. Alone, too, felt the fatigue, just as Evan said. Long journeys are always tiring. It would have been a lot more peaceful if we hadn't gone to that labyrinth-like place. Their tiredness was not only from the long journey, but also because Alone had made several stops in the past week. It was necessary. That was Alone's only reply to Evan. In truth, the reason they had made all those stops on the way to Caliban was to prepare for the upcoming battle without a god. The lotus-shaped necklace now hanging around Alone's neck, which hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, was part of those preparations. Ignoring Evan's gaze, Alone changed the subject. "Deus has returned from his expedition, right?" "Yes, he should be here." Alone fell silent for a moment before asking, "He'll meet with me, won't he?" "I'm sure he will," Evan replied, though Alone remained slightly skeptical. "It's not just about meeting him, the real challenge is getting him to agree to my request." Alone had provided Deus with a great deal of financial support over the years and even saved him from what could have been a disastrous situation. In terms of pure cause and effect, Alone was definitely in the position of a benefactor. But realistically, from Deus's perspective, Alone was probably just a faceless person who had generously spent money to help him from afar. After all, Alone had never actually met Deus in person. Without any direct interaction, it was hard to expect any real closeness, so now that he was finally in Curdum, Alone couldn't help but feel a little anxious. I can only hope the gifts will win him over. As Alone mulled over his thoughts, they finally reached the northern gate of Curdum, where they joined the line for inspection, just like any other travelers entering the capital. Even though he was a noble in the Asteria kingdom, when traveling abroad, inspections were mandatory for everyone. After briefly explaining his identity to the soldier conducting the inspection, Alone waited for Evan to finish as the line of carriages slowly moved forward. "Excuse me, Count." "Yes?" "There seems to be a slight problem." Evan leaned his head into the carriage, speaking, which made Alone tilt his head in confusion. He nodded slightly and stepped down from the carriage, where he was greeted by a knight with an overly confident expression. The knight had red hair and a lion crest on his chest, exuding an air of arrogance. As Alone looked at him curiously, the knight spoke. "Are you Count Palacio?" "That's correct." Though they had never met, the knight spoke informally, as if the facial expressions in this fantasy world were enough to reveal a person's personality. As Alone replied, Evan leaned in to whisper into his ear. "That knight seems to be a disciple of Fiola." "Fiola?" "Yes, you know, the fourth sword." At Evan's words, Alone finally let out a low murmur of realization. A master knight known as the Fourth Sword, Fiola, came to Alone's mind, and though he nodded, he still wore a puzzled expression. So, why is the disciple of the Fourth Sword here, and with a whole group of knights? As Alone glanced around, he noticed several other knights wearing the same lion crest as Fiola. "What business do you have with me?" Turning back to Fiola's disciple, Alone asked. The knight, who had been leisurely walking toward him with a smirk, finally introduced himself. "First of all, I'm Violin, a direct disciple of Sir Fiola." "And?" "I've heard that my friend owes you a small debt." "Friend?" When Alone asked, Violin smiled and continued. "Yes, a friend. I don't recall having any significant connections here in Caliban. My friend doesn't have any particular ties to Caliban either. He's from the kingdom of Ashtalon." At those words, Alone instinctively muttered, "Ashtalon Kingdom. Who?" But then he quickly remembered and let out a low, understanding sigh. "Carmine." "That's right, you remember. He contacted me." Hearing Violin's words, Alone couldn't hide his disbelief. "Wait, I didn't do anything to that guy. Wait, how long has it been?" "A few weeks." For a moment, Alone was impressed by the petty thug Carmine running to his friends to complain within just over 2 weeks. "I also owe him a bit, so I have to at least make an appearance." "So, you've been waiting here all this time just to make that appearance?" "To be precise, I've been waiting for word. All carriages from the kingdom of Asteria pass through this gate." Alone felt a wave of dizziness at Violin's nonchalant words, as if apologizing for the inconvenience, but not really meaning it. Even though nobility's influence diminishes significantly in foreign lands, it wasn't to the extent that one would be treated like this at the gates. "So, what's your plan?" "I'll give you 2 choices. Those valuable-looking goods in your carriage, how about gifting them all to us? And the other choice? Spend about 3 weeks in the underground dungeon." "You're well aware that I'm a noble from another country, aren't you?" Alone asked, knowing that imprisoning a foreign noble without cause would undoubtedly cause trouble. "I am Sir Fiola's only direct disciple." Violin's next words left Alone dumbfounded. What Violin was essentially saying was, I can cause a ruckus, and because of my status, I'll face no consequences. The ridiculous part was that Violin's statement held some truth. Here, Alone was merely a foreign noble, but Violin was the sole direct disciple of a master knight. Unbelievable, birds of a feather really do flock together. Alone sighed, realizing that this bunch of thugs were perfectly matched for each other. Just as Alone sighed, Violin gave a wicked smile. But to be honest, no matter which option you choose, the result will be the same. Violin lightly tapped Alone's stomach with the hilt of his sword. "After all, my friend only asked for one thing." Violin casually threatened Alone. Evan, who had been silent until now, slowly began to scowl. He instinctively reached for the sword at his waist when, "Hey, Hertilda!" a voice called out from behind, causing both Alone and Violin to turn their heads. There, Alone saw him. Deus Macallion. Dressed in black iron armor, wearing a cold expression, Deus was walking toward them. The moment he appeared, the atmosphere at the gate grew heavy, as if the air itself was weighed down. Despite the fact that it was just one person arriving, the soldiers straightened their postures, eyes wide in shock. Even the knights, who had been wearing relaxed expressions moments ago, now stood upright, their faces tense. Attention! The soldiers, who had been casually observing the situation, immediately raised their swords in salute upon seeing Deus, but he didn't spare them a glance. "We greet the great sword!" The Knights of Violence group, Yuzon, shouted in reverence, but Deus ignored them as well. Instead, he walked directly toward Alone. Seeing this, Violin hurriedly pulled back the sword he had pointed at Alone, trying to speak, but... Crash! Gah! Deus's hand shot out and grabbed Violin by the throat. What? Violin quickly reached for Deus's hand in protest, but... What do you think you're doing? At those cold words, Violin's face turned pale as he struggled to breathe, his eyes wide with fear. How dare you lay a hand on my benefactor? Delman, known as Caliban's Master Knight and the third of the 5 great swords, was in a very good mood. This was because, on this recent expedition, he had killed Kulkan, one of the 8 chiefs, and rumored to be quite strong among them. Of course, the method he used to kill Kulkan was something that neither Caliban nor the barbarians would ever acknowledge. He had challenged Kulkan to a duel, then, when Kulkan came out alone, Delman used hidden soldiers, various traps, and poison to kill him. Even though Caliban and the barbarians were at war, they always respected each other's honor in battle, making Delman's actions outrageously dishonorable. However, instead of feeling guilty for his deceit, Delman smiled with the thought that he no longer had to give up his third position to Deus, one of the newly entered 5 swords. With that thought, he slaughtered all the barbarians who were present at the scene, leaving no one alive. This would have been impossible for him alone, but the numerous soldiers he had stationed outside, so they wouldn't witness the duel, made it achievable. Delman had successfully earned merit, and now all that was left was to return and report his accomplishments. As he made his way back to one of Caliban's forward bases, he saw something that stopped him. He saw it. A man with red hair matching the symbolic power of fire stood with a tense expression. He and his red flame knights were staring at the base, or what used to be the base. The place had become a wasteland. The grey earth was smeared with red blood, ruins lay scattered, and thousands of corpses littered the ground as if they were nothing. However, what drew all their attention wasn't the ruins but the man standing in the middle of it all. Wearing the barbarian signature leather clothing, he stood proudly at the center of the ruined base. As Delman turned to look at him, the man also turned his gaze towards Delman and started walking toward him. At a glance, it seemed like the man was inviting his own death, as Delman had not only 100 knights but also countless soldiers by his side. No matter how strong this barbarian chieftain was, he couldn't handle such a large force alone. Yet, despite recognizing the overwhelming odds, Delman's expression was filled with tension. The first reason was the state of the base, now reduced to ruins, and the second was the aura. Although Delman had committed a dishonorable act, he was still a sword master, someone who could cut off a mountain peak with a single slash and claim the lives of dozens of barbarians with one stroke. And as such, he could clearly sense the extraordinary aura emanating from this man. And then? "Are you Delman?" The man's voice echoed, a voice that didn't sound human, and just hearing it for a moment shook Delman to his core. Delman quickly regained his composure and instinctively raised his aura blade as he responded. "Who are you?" "Then answer me, Delman. Why did you desecrate the sacred and honorable duel?" "What?" "Answer me. Why did you sully the great and holy duel, the honorable fight between 2 warriors? Speak." Hearing the barbarian's words, Delman realized that the man was talking about his duel with Kulkan, and he replied. This is a battlefield. Isn't it foolish to believe in a duel in such a place?" The barbarian stared at Delman, unfazed, and spoke again. "How dare you speak of the great duel like that?" His voice was filled with clear displeasure. "I already told you, this is a battlefield. This is your last chance, human, a warrior of considerable strength. Fight me in a duel. If you win, I will let you go." At the barbarian's offer of a last chance, Delman did not respond, he just... "Everyone, prepare for battle," he commanded the knights. As soon as his order was given, the knights and soldiers swiftly drew their weapons in perfect unison. The Knights of the Red Flame, who had fought alongside Delman in numerous battles in the Northern War and led them to victory time and time again, all wore resolute expressions as they drew their swords and deployed their auras. Watching this scene, the barbarian muttered, as if in lamentation and disdain, "Do knights truly possess no honor?" With that muttering, creak tilde, the surrounding corpses began to rise. What is this? The knights were startled by the sudden change, but the phenomenon continued regardless of their emotions. A knight with his head split in half. A soldier with half of his body blown away. A rider with his upper torso severed. They slowly began to awaken. And then, "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Kill me, please, I beg you." The screams of the dead filled the grey earth. You mortals, without even the honor to your name, are unnecessary in this world. That presence vanished. Even Delman, who had stepped into the realm of a superhuman, couldn't keep up with the speed. But then, however, Delman turned his gaze to the voice that had suddenly appeared, and the barbarian had already slammed his hand into the ground. Boom! The earth exploded instantly, rocks and debris shot into the sky, and simultaneously, the soldiers and knights who had been standing ready were all hurled into the air. And with just one swing of the barbarian's foot through the air. Crack! The soldiers and knights flying through the sky were struck by the debris, their bodies turning into mere chunks of flesh. Without even time to scream, their remains splattered across the ground, creating countless red flowers of blood. As Delman belatedly tried to swing his sword, he realized in that moment, his arm was gone. Delman's scream echoed, and the soldiers who hadn't yet grasped the situation finally understood what had happened. In just an instant, the Master Knight and most of his knightly order had been annihilated. Panic spread like a plague among the soldiers, robbing them of their will. The terror rooted in their hearts quickly spread, leaving them paralyzed. In the chaos of the massacre, Delman, who had lost his arm, looked at the barbarian in disbelief. Who are you? The barbarian, no, the god of all barbarians and the father of duels, Ultultus, crushed Delman's internal organs with his rough hands, finishing his task. He looked down at Delman, who lay beneath his hand. A moment later. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Though his internal organs were completely shattered, Delman rose again, spewing blood across the grey snowfield and screaming in agony like the others. Satisfied, Ultultus grinned as he spoke. All you gathered barbarians. He turned his gaze to the surviving soldiers, who were frozen in terror. Prove yourselves through a duel. And then, prove that you are not savages. He offered them a duel. If you do, I shall grant you an honorable death. On the blood-stained Colosseum made of the dead. Master Knight and disciple of the Fourth Sword, Violin, couldn't understand the current situation. The reason he had come here today was simply to help out his friend, Carmine, who was also a very valuable supplier, by taking care of a certain noble from the kingdom of Asteria. Of course, given that the 6 kingdoms were united under the Union Kingdom, normally, even if the noble was from another country, he should have shown some level of courtesy. A misstep could quickly turn into an international issue. However, the reason Violin had accepted Carmine's request without hesitation wasn't just because of the item Carmine had offered. After considering the circumstances, Violin thought there was no chance the situation would escalate. There were 3 reasons for his judgment. The first was that, among the 6 kingdoms in the Union, Caliban, which constantly fended off the barbarians from the north, held the most influence. The second was that rumors about Count Palatio had yet to spread again, meaning his reputation remained that of a reckless noble who had only become a count by sheer luck, and he had no connections in Caliban. The third was that, even if the situation did go wrong, Violin believed that his master, Fiola, who stood at the pinnacle of Caliban, would somehow smooth things over. Although not as gifted as Deus, Violin was talented with the sword and had always been under his master's protection. With these 3 reasons in mind, Violin thought there would be no harm to himself in dealing with Count Palatio, and, truthfully, his judgment wasn't wrong. However, there was one thing Violin didn't know. And that was... crack! Count Palatio was, in fact, a benefactor to Deus Macallion, a master knight currently hailed as a hero in Caliban. Goo! Deus had earned the nickname the Swordless after defeating Kurga of the Snowfields, one of the 8 chieftains, in a duel. Uff! Violin, who was slammed into a tree, groaned with a fearful and defiant expression as he tried to speak. Wait! Lord Deus! But he couldn't finish. Deus's foot struck his stomach before Violin could open his mouth. The knights of Yuzon, who had just been showing their respect, instinctively tried to draw their swords at the sight, but the moment you draw your swords, I leave the rest to your imagination. Just by turning his gaze and saying those words, the knights swallowed their breaths in silence, and then the one-sided beating began. Watching this, Alone, who stood with an outwardly expressionless face as Deus mercilessly pummeled Violin, but inwardly, he was filled with a deep, satisfied smile. You've grown up so well. Alone gazed at Deus as if he were a father watching his son grow up splendidly. Not that any father would feel proud watching his son ruthlessly beat someone else, but Alone felt something akin to paternal pride in that moment. Actually, it was more than that, he even felt a strange sense of gratitude. Alone had been thinking all the way to Caliban that Deus likely wouldn't be too fond of him. Perhaps Deus might tolerate him, but Alone had thought it would stop there, never expecting any deeper emotion. After all, Alone had never had a personal conversation with Deus, and more importantly, Deus had never written him a single letter. So, when Deus referred to him as his benefactor earlier, Alone felt as if all the effort he had put into raising Deus had finally been rewarded, and a pleased smile spread across his face. He hits well. Indeed. Watching Deus break Violin apart in real time, Alone wore a calm smile, and after about 3 minutes, he felt as if a weight had been lifted from his heart. Alone was deeply grateful to Deus for going this far. But 5 minutes later. Count. What? Isn't he going to die? Alone, sensing something was wrong, watched Deus mercilessly beat Violin, who was pathetically clinging to his legs, crying and begging for forgiveness. No way. Would he? Well, yeah. Even so, Alone kept thinking, surely he wouldn't kill him, as he observed Deus's beating for another 5 minutes. After confirming that Violin's face was now so disfigured that it no longer resembled the cunning expression it had shown just 10 minutes earlier, Alone broke into a cold sweat and suddenly remembered. The Deus standing before him. Oh. Was one of the 5 great sins. Of course, that didn't mean the feeling of gratitude had disappeared. It hadn't disappeared, but it's nice that he went this far for me, but Alone watched as Deus, leaving the half-crippled Violin behind, walked towards him. I'm at your service. Bowing his head as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Alone noticed the soldiers and knights murmuring at the scene. Ah, Alone thought, glancing at the blood-soaked Violin. Isn't this a bit excessive? Malon, a guard working in the capital of Caliban, Curdom, loves rumors. The reason is simple, spending all day on duty at the city walls can be boring, and gossip is one of the ways to make his shifts more enjoyable. For that reason, Malon had been waiting for this day, or more precisely, for the day Count Palacio would arrive. He had heard a secret rumor that the troublemaker, who ran wild under the shadow of his master, had asked to be summoned as soon as Count Palacio arrived. Malon didn't know why that troublemaker was seeking out a count from another country, but he knew what would happen next. After all, there was only one reason that troublemaker ever sought someone out. Thanks to this, Malon was expecting a highly entertaining spectacle once Count Palacio arrived. However, what he saw was far from what he had expected. It wasn't Count Palacio who was being beaten, but Violin, and the one assaulting him was none other than Deus. Deus, one of the master knights of Caliban, had risen to the top of the knightly order in less than a year with unmatched talent, earning the title of Mucan, swordless. It was Deus who had struck Violin. Even that was enough to shock everyone in the capital, where rumors spread like wildfire in a single day. But Malon was even more stunned by what happened next. The swordless bowed his head. Malon stared, mouth agape, at Deus bowing his head as he spoke. Did Sir Swordless just bow his head? The swordless? The guards around him were equally shocked. The reason for their disbelief was simple. Until now, Deus had never bowed to anyone in Caliban, except for the current king. There was even an incident where he slapped the second prince 3 times for harassing his only sister, an event still talked about in the capital. Deus's reputation soared after that, even though the second prince was known as a troublemaker abandoned by the royal family. Despite committing an offense against royalty, Deus wasn't punished, further elevating his status. It essentially meant that the entire kingdom of Caliban regarded Deus Macallion as more important than the second prince, and his reputation only grew stronger. Yet here he was, bowing his head to a mere count from another country. Please, get in. Seeing Deus bowing to Count Palacio was enough to shock anyone familiar with the rumors. Soon, all eyes were on the count, who walked without expression, escorted by the Master Knight, as if this situation didn't faze him at all. And then, who exactly is this Count Palacio, that the swordless would bow to him? Malon and everyone who saw the Count's face had the same question on their minds, their mouths hanging open in astonishment. This situation is strange, but why are they looking at me like that? Alone, the one receiving these shocked stares, felt puzzled by the situation. Please, get in. He then turned his gaze at Deus's words and noticed the carriage waiting for him. It stands out. Unlike other carriages, it was painted entirely in black, making it impossible to miss. An thud. Surrounded by knights as if they were guarding it like a fortress, Alone started to understand why people were staring at him this way. Even he thought this was a bit too much. Got it. However, it would be ridiculous to refuse to ride the carriage at this point, so Alone quietly got in. I will take care of the carriage then, said Evan, ending the conversation as Alone, now in the carriage with Deus, headed toward the mansion under the escort of the Black Knights. A short while later? Is this all the mansion? Seeing Deus's mansion for the first time, Alone was visibly surprised. He had heard that Caliban's capital was large compared to other kingdoms, but this was the first time he'd seen a mansion of such immense size. Is this what success looks like? Alone briefly mused as he followed Deus, who led the way from the carriage through the vast mansion towards the office. Once inside the office. Please, have a seat. Alone looked slightly puzzled as Deus offered him the seat of honor without hesitation. Even though Alone had little knowledge of formal etiquette, he knew the basics. Isn't the owner supposed to sit in the seat of honor? Of course, if Alone were of a higher rank, things might be different, but he was only a count, and not even a noble of Caliban, but from the kingdom of Asteria. In short, there was no need for Deus to treat him with such excessive courtesy. From Alone's perspective, Deus's treatment made him feel like a proud father whose son had made a great success. He felt pleased but also slightly concerned. He had quite a few favors to ask Deus. Clearing his throat, Alone sat in the seat of honor, and Deus naturally sat beside him. A heavy silence followed. What should I talk about? Of course, there were many things Alone needed to ask for, but he knew that communication doesn't work that way. First, he needed to make some small talk. But having never spoken to Deus face to face, let alone exchanged letters, Alone felt awkward. Just as he was struggling with the silence. Creak! I'm a bit late. Evan, guided in by the knights, cautiously entered the room, and Alone realized that Evan had brought a gift. Evan, the gift. Understood. At Alone's command, Evan placed the gift on Deus's desk. This is a gift. At Deus's response, Alone let out a small sigh. He had been wondering how to start the conversation, and now the gift had given him a way in. Thank you. Deus bowed his head slightly to Alone. And then, silence. All right, isn't this the part where the conversation naturally follows? The thought passed through Alone's mind, and he finally opened his mouth. Aren't you going to open the gift? It would be improper to open it now, I'll do so later. Alone understood that it was indeed rude to open a gift in front of a high-ranking person with too much excitement. But Alone wasn't a high-ranking noble himself. What exactly does he think of me? Alone's confusion was apparent, but his bewilderment didn't last long. Because? Creak! Be brother. Before he could gather his thoughts, a young girl entered Deus's office. Like Deus, she had striking purple eyes. She glanced around the room before her gaze settled on Evan. Oh. Brother Evan. Recognizing him, she greeted him with a familiar smile. Oh, silly. Evan also smiled warmly as he stood up, and Alone quickly realized that the girl was Deus's younger sister, whom Evan had been sent to rescue. They do look alike. In the game's Psychedelia, only the tragic circumstances of her death were described, so Alone had never seen her appearance. Yet, now that he saw her in person, he couldn't help but nod in agreement at the strong resemblance. As he turned his gaze to Deus, Alone was startled. Deus had a distinctly displeased expression on his face. When Silly grabbed Evan's hand, his eyes grew even sharper. Silly, Evan is not your brother. He's an old man, Deus remarked. Watching this, Alone quickly realized how protective Deus was of his sister. In short, it was safe to call him a *Siscon star. Though Alone understood Deus's attachment, knowing from the game that he had suffered a great sense of loss and lack of family, it was still amusing. As Alone was thinking about this, Silly, who had been playing with Evan moments before, suddenly came over to Alone and spoke cheerfully. "You Count Palacio, right?" "That's correct. I heard from Evan. You gave the order to save me." Hearing this, Alone glanced at Deus, then nodded quietly. "I just did my duty. If you died, your brother could have turned into a continental killing machine." "Thank you so much," Silly said, bowing deeply. Seeing her heartfelt gratitude warmed Alone's heart. Even though his actions had been motivated by other intentions, receiving sincere thanks for his good deeds felt rewarding. Alone smiled slightly. After Silly left, the atmosphere relaxed a little. Alone cleared his throat, glancing at Deus, who still wore a subtly hostile expression toward Evan after his sister's departure. "Deus, the reason I've come to see you is that I need a favor." "A favor?" Deus asked, looking slightly confused. "Yes. Is there something strange about that?" Alone responded with equal confusion. "No, nothing. Please, go ahead." Though Deus's words seemed a little odd, Alone paused for a moment. He found it hard to speak now that it was time to make his request. He had 2 favors to ask of Deus, and both were likely to be somewhat difficult. After hesitating, Alone finally spoke up with the first request. "I need to go to the north. Could you accompany me?" "Of course." Alone blinked, surprised at how easily Deus agreed. "Is it really that simple?" "Yes, I was planning a northern expedition anyway." Hearing this, Alone felt relieved. The first request, at least, turned out to be relatively easy. Taking a deep breath of relief, Alone made his second request. "Could I borrow the Ring of the Arrogant One from the Caliban Royal Treasury?" As he made this request, Alone watched Deus carefully. After all, asking to borrow something from the royal treasury was essentially like indebting oneself to the royal family, and it could be quite a tricky matter for Deus. No matter how powerful Deus was, he was still bound by the political interests of the Kingdom of Caliban. However, the Ring of the Arrogant One was essential for Alone's plan, and he had to ask, even if it put Deus in an awkward position. "Of course, I don't want this to cause you any trouble," Alone began, trying to soften the request and offer compensation, but... "Understood," Deus interrupted. "What?" "I will retrieve the Ring of the Arrogant One right away." Deus bowed slightly as he spoke, leaving Alone bewildered once again. "Wait, this is good, but is it really okay?" With a slightly dazed expression, Alone asked, "You know where it is, right?" "I've heard it's in the royal treasury of Caliban." "And isn't it a bit difficult to get it?" "It usually takes about a week by normal means, but if you wish, I can retrieve it immediately." "Is there a way to do that?" Curious about Deus's bold claim, Alone inquired. Deus paused for a moment, seeming to consider something, then replied. "The king might be a bit troublesome, but I can handle about 50 people, so it shouldn't be too difficult." "Who?" Evan, who was nearby, was visibly taken aback, and though Alone didn't show it as openly, he was just as baffled by Deus's unwavering determination. Is this his way of showing how far he's willing to go for me? Interpreting Deus's words as a sign of his loyalty, Alone hesitated before saying, "No, there's no need to go that far." "Understood. I will retrieve the ring as quickly as possible." Deus looked somewhat disappointed as he agreed. Alone, for a brief moment, thought, "I just wanted you to borrow it," but he quickly nodded in response. He really cares about me, but isn't this a bit much? And with that thought, Alone spent a day at the mansion while waiting for the ring to be retrieved. "I've brought it." "What?" Alone stared at the precious jewel-encrusted box containing the Ring of the Arrogant One. And then... "What?" "Count, did you hear? Yesterday, Deus apparently caused a ruckus at the royal palace demanding the treasure. I also heard he slapped the second prince again." At Evan's report, Alone was left utterly speechless. What is going on? Alone began to realize something was off about Deus. 3 days had passed since they obtained the Ring of the Arrogant One and began preparing to leave for the north. By the time the knights and soldiers had finished preparing, the expedition force had already departed for the north. Not long after their departure, Deus McCallion. A man approached Deus. He had long blue hair and a vertical scar across his face. This was Fiola, one of the master knights of Caliban, known as the Fourth Sword. "You laid a hand on my disciple," Fiola said, his expression cold, his eyes betraying a hidden fury. Deus, with an indifferent expression, responded, "Your disciple acted rudely towards my benefactor." Ha, and that gives you the right to beat someone else's disciple senseless. Do you think it doesn't? Deus replied. Fayola frowned at Deus's words. His anger was clear on his face, and the intense energy he exuded filled the air, causing the knights around them to break out in a cold sweat. However, Deus, who took the full brunt of this power head-on, remained unfazed. You're lucky I didn't kill him, Fayola. Deus's aura turned even more ominous, emitting a terrifying purple energy that pressed down on Fayola. The tension between them was so thick that it seemed like a sword fight would break out the moment someone drew a weapon. But after a moment of silence, TCH. Fayola was the first to turn away. Clicking his tongue, he glanced at Count Palacio, who was standing behind Deus. Don't think I'm going to just let this go, Fayola said before returning to his resting battalion. Alone, watching Fayola leave, Alone thought to himself, terrifying. He felt a tingling in his hands as he subconsciously clenched and unclenched his fists. So that's a master knight for you. Just the sheer power Fayola unintentionally released had left Alone breathless. At that moment, Evan, standing nearby, muttered in disbelief, that's insane, he's a complete monster. Alone turned his gaze to Deus. Despite the overwhelming energy Fayola had directed at him, Deus showed no signs of discomfort, which reminded Alone again that Deus was a master knight as well. It wasn't that he ever forgot this fact, but Deus had been rather humble towards him recently, so seeing this side of him was a fresh reminder. Honestly, he's kind of rude to everyone else except me, Alone mused. He recalled rumors from a few days ago about Deus and thought of the time Deus had snapped at Evan, telling him, "Shut up, old man." Rescuing his sister must have been the right move after all, Alone thought to himself. Initially, he hadn't understood why Deus was so obedient to him, but now it was becoming clear. In fact, he didn't even need to guess anymore. Just watching Deus around his sister was answer enough. Maybe in the future, if I call for help while running my estate, he'll come running to save me, Alone grinned at the thought, though deep down he knew Deus wouldn't go that far. He shrugged lightly and returned to his carriage. The expedition to the north continued. 2 weeks and 3 days later, the expedition force crossed the border between Caliban and the north and arrived at their first outpost. There, they received 3 pieces of news. The first was the death of Delman, the third sword, who had gone missing after news came that the eastern outpost of Caliban had fallen and the enemy appeared. The second was that Kiriana, the second sword, who had been leading an advanced expedition to the western outpost, had suffered severe injuries in battle against the enemy. And the final news was, "Undead, you say?" The messenger reported that the enemy was approaching the outpost, leading an army of the undead. Yes, the enemy has been reanimating fallen soldiers and knights into undead and marching with them. At the messenger's words, Fayola let out a deep sigh and muttered, "This is troubling." Deus, hearing the same news, remained silent. If the messenger's words were true, the situation was clearly unfavorable for Caliban. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense. Even the master knights and the nobles leading the soldiers were reluctant to speak. Finally, one of the nobles cautiously suggested, "Perhaps we should retreat." That simple suggestion unleashed a flood of opinions from the other attendees. "Are you serious? You want us to turn our backs and run from the barbarians?" "That's not what I meant. I'm saying we should wait for a better opportunity. We're already in a bad position, and the second sword is severely injured, not to mention Reinhard still hasn't returned from his seclusion. Do you really think we stand a chance? At this point, do you think the injured could even escape while the barbarians advance on the outpost?" The room quickly descended into chaos, but in the end, the opinions of the nobles didn't hold much weight. The true leaders of the expedition were the 2 master knights. Eventually, the nobles looked toward Fayola and Deus for direction. "Let's think it over. I'll call for another meeting later. For now, everyone, take a break and clear your minds," Fayola said, standing up from his seat. Deus also rose without a word and exited the tent. Outside, the land was the same dull grey as always. But to Deus, who had reached a certain level as a master knight, the world looked very different. The red snowfields. To Deus's eyes, the grey land appeared as a crimson world, filled with an eerie, ominous energy. The sky, consumed by this sinister red mana, was both beautiful and terrifying, a sight that even made someone as strong as Deus feel a faint sense of intimidation. He silently observed this strange world. After glancing at Fayola, who was likely seeing the same scene, Deus turned his gaze elsewhere. There, he saw Alone, the great moon. Even though this terrifying world lay before him, Alone showed no signs of fear or awe. Instead, he sat calmly by the fire, eating a sweet potato with a blank expression. Unlike Deus, who couldn't tear his eyes away from the crimson sky, Alone hadn't glanced at the ominous landscape even once. He simply muttered to himself while eating. Diffraction, compression, focal point, annihilation. The great moon mumbled incomprehensible words as if he had seen this world countless times before, words that Deus couldn't begin to understand. Watching him, Deus felt a surge of curiosity about Alone's purpose for being in the north. Of course, Deus had a rough idea that the great moon was here to deal with the enemy, but that didn't quell all of his questions. After all, from Deus's perspective, the great moon didn't seem particularly powerful, neither now nor in the past. Maybe he just can't see what I'm seeing. Deus glanced back up at the red sky. This scene was one that only those who had reached a certain level of enlightenment could see. The eerie landscape was enough to make him frown instinctively. But what if it was simply that the great moon couldn't see this scene? If that were the case, his behavior might be somewhat understandable. Just as Deus was pondering this. Seriously, back off. A loud, high-pitched voice suddenly caught Deus's attention. Turning to the source, he saw a knight facing off against a mage. Please, just a little more help. You know how dire the situation is, the knight pleaded. I know that. But no matter how hard I try, I can't do anything more. I have to leave. Even so, just one more time. No. I told you, it's impossible, you idiots. The mage screamed hysterically, while the knights continued to press her. Deus easily recognized the knights by their armor. They were members of Silver Shade, the knight order serving the second sword of Caliban, Kiriana. Opposite them stood Penia, the deputy tower master of the Blue Tower. Dragged out here for research when I have so much work to do, why won't they just leave me alone? Penia complained. But shouldn't saving lives come first? The knight insisted. I'm telling you, I've done everything I can. There's nothing more I can do. I'm not refusing out of laziness, I've already done all I can. Watching the tantrum of Penia, the young prodigy of the magic world who had reached the 6th rank at a young age, Deus felt a moment of confusion but quickly understood. He remembered that the Caliban outpost was working in collaboration with mags from the Blue Tower to research the barbarians' rituals. Deputy Tower Master, her. She's strong, Deus thought, noting the remarkable energy emanating from her. As Penia continued pushing the knights aside in frustration, she noticed Deus standing in her path. She scowled and was about to speak. What are you? But froze before she could finish. Deus raised an eyebrow, confused by her sudden silence. But then he realized that she wasn't looking at him, but at someone behind him. Why? Penia's trembling voice broke the tense air, and terror filled her eyes as if she had seen something that shouldn't exist. Her body subtly shook, and Deus instinctively followed her gaze. Standing there was Alone, who had just been munching on a sweet potato a moment ago. Now, he was staring back at Deus and Penia with a puzzled expression. A brief moment passed, and then... It's been a while, Deputy Tower Master, Alone greeted calmly. Why yes, hello. Penia stammered, suddenly acting like a scared kitten, her head lowered, all traces of her previous hysteria gone. How have you been? Alone asked. I've been well. Watching Penia, whom Deus had previously regarded as a powerful figure, now cowering like a stray cat, he couldn't help but be baffled. Was I simply ignorant all this time? Deus thought, quietly reflecting on his understanding of the situation. Most of the members of the Eclipse Order, led by Deus Macallion, supported Alone. However, they acted that way solely because Alone was considered Deus's benefactor. In reality, their feelings toward Alone were close to indifference. To the Knights of the Eclipse, Alone wasn't particularly special, aside from being Deus's benefactor. Even if there were emotions involved, it was only due to the jealousy some young knights felt when they saw how Deus treated Alone. Other than that, there were hardly any feelings toward him at all. In short, the knights didn't hold particularly positive sentiments toward Alone. But at least for this moment. Vice Tower Master, may I ask you a favor? Yes. What kind of favor? The knights could only stare blankly, mouths agape. Could you make a potion of Levitian? Remissions, potion. Yes. Can you do it? Yes, of course. Absolutely. Not only the Knights of Eclipse but even the Silver Knights, who were just recently berated by Penia, were shocked. This was because they knew that the Vice Tower Master in front of them had a personality as eccentric as her genius magical abilities. In fact, it wasn't just them. Any knight who had ever gone on an expedition to the north would have heard stories of the hysteric Penia. When heading north, wizards from the Blue Tower, who were often summoned at the same time, would always complain about Penia's unbearable personality, so it was impossible not to know. Thus, the knights, aware of Penia's notorious character, were even more astonished. Just to check, do you happen to have or know how to make the elixir of exceptionality? I don't have it, but I think I could make it. Could you also make that for me? Well, it takes a lot of time, and I have other things to do. I really need it. I'll do it. I promise I will. The knights couldn't believe what they were seeing. Penia, the Vice Tower Master of the Blue Tower and a 6th-ranked wizard, was obediently following the Count of Palacio's orders. No, more than obediently, she was contorting herself to avoid upsetting him in any way. The knights found it utterly unbelievable. And of course, what the hell? The same went for the wizards who had been dispatched from the Blue Tower with Penia, enduring her constant scolding and shedding tears of blood from the torment. What is this? Am I seeing things? Has the Vice Tower Master completely lost it? The wizards, who looked on as if they were witnessing the end of the world, gasped in disbelief. She refused to make that last time because it was too difficult and spent weeks complaining, but now she's willing to make it. Am I seeing this wrong? Did someone cast an illusion spell as a joke? Are you stupid? If someone had cast an illusion spell, they'd have to cast silence on the Vice Tower Master as well, and who has that kind of spare magic power? They were so shocked that they even subtly tried to dispel any lingering magic, thinking perhaps another wizard was playing a trick. And then, thank you. No, it's something I should do. How much payment will you need? Par payment, you mean? It's only natural to pay for the favor I've asked. Just tell me, and I'll have it sent to the Magic Tower later. Oh, well. However, if it's a bit expensive, the payment might be delayed. The finances haven't been great lately. Just give me 1 gold coin. 1 gold coin? Isn't that too cheap? No, it's fine. Yes, it's totally fine. Well then, I won't refuse such a generous offer. As they watched Penia, who was smiling and accepting just 1 gold coin for 2 potions that normally cost hundreds of gold coins to make, both the knights and the wizards wore blank expressions. They soon all turned their gazes toward Alone. The knights' faces were filled with amazement, while a look of reverence appeared on the wizards' faces. It seems like there's some misunderstanding, but at least I got the potions easily, Alone thought, as he returned to Evan. Wait, Count, when did you start speaking informally with the Vice Tower Master? I'm a noble, so I just spoke informally. No way. Excuse me? But as far as I know, the Vice Tower Master is treated as a quasi-noble, and it's standard etiquette to speak formally to each other. Is that so? Yes. Realizing that he had been somewhat rude to Penia, Alone let out a quiet sigh. With this, I've gathered all the cards I need to play. Not long after, Alone obtained that Levitian's potion and the elixir of exceptionality from Penia. A few hours later, he heard Deus's words. Retreat! Yes. Deus began explaining the current situation, and Alone nodded slightly as he listened. It's true, they don't seem capable of fighting. Alone recalled the many injured soldiers and the expressions of terror on their faces when he had arrived at the forward base. The knights looked relatively fine, but their expressions weren't good either. The only people walking around with calm expressions were the wizards, who were here to investigate the ritual, not to fight. As for the wizards, they already fled. Alone glanced around. Unlike earlier, when the area was bustling with wizards, there were none to be seen since Penia had delivered the potions. Realizing that the wizards had already hit the escape button after sensing the danger at the forward base, Alone heard Deus's question. What do you intend to do? Without hesitation, Alone replied. I will stay here. The reason Alone had brought so many items to Caliban, including borrowing the Ring of the Arrogant One from the royal family, was to deal with the Outer God. Without dealing with the Outer God, the future he foresaw would be nothing but a disaster. As Alone was reviewing the plans in his mind. Wah! Suddenly, a terrible scream came from the distance. He immediately stood up and rushed outside the tent. There, he saw a wizard screaming wildly, along with other wizards fleeing frantically toward the forward base. And then, behind them, the undead were approaching. It's the undead! Ah! The soldiers screamed, as if recalling a recent nightmare, and gathered at the entrance with their swords drawn. The knights, too, began to ready their weapons as confusion and fear spread across their faces. Despite the sudden chaos, Alone quickly grasped what had happened. A raid. Realizing that the outer god had moved even faster than the fleeing wizards anticipated, Alone's thoughts came to a halt as, "Everyone, draw your swords!" With Fiola's urgent shout from the barracks, the battle began. The undead who charge in blindly without any tactics or strategy are far inferior in combat strength compared to a well-trained army. Even if the necromancers of this continent were to raise the undead through necromancy, they could never overcome well-trained soldiers. However, please save me. This unit of undead was fundamentally different from those controlled by ordinary necromancers. Die. Just die. Please. The soldiers thrust their spears into the undead. Some aimed for the heart, others the head, and some targeted the legs. The soldiers' spears pierced various parts of the undead bodies. If these were corpses raised by a necromancer, the damage inflicted would have been so severe that they should have already ceased to function. But even with spears lodged in their bodies, the undead continued to advance. The sight of them walking forward with spears still embedded was more than enough to instill terror in the soldiers. Squelch! Grrk! A soldier instantly died, his throat pierced by the sword of an undead. The situation became even more dire as the undead immediately attacked the soldier next to him. The seed of fear planted in the soldier's instincts was more than ready to bloom. Their formation crumbled, and in an instant, the battlefield descended into chaos. This, in turn, increased the number of deaths, which only led to more undead rising from the fallen, creating the worst kind of vicious cycle. Yet, despite the grim situation, the soldiers gritted their teeth, their bloodshot eyes wide open as they continued to fight. Why? Because they still had hope. The knights, wielding aura-infused weapons, were quickly cutting down the overwhelming numbers of undead, reducing them by the thousands. The wizards, who had joined the battle later, were eliminating the undead even faster than the knights. Among them, the magic unleashed by Penia was particularly astounding. Icicle. Crack. Crash crash crash. Her magic was nothing short of extraordinary. Hundreds of undead advancing toward the soldiers were instantly frozen and shattered into pieces, a truly magnificent spectacle. However, even more than Penia, the figures that filled the soldiers with hope were the two master knights present, Fiola and Deus. Of the two, Deus's presence was especially overwhelming. SSSHT. Dozens of undead surrounded him. Some were soldiers with large wounds on their heads, others were knights with gaping holes in their chests. But in an instant, the hundreds of undead around Deus suddenly halted, as if time itself had stopped. And then, swish! With a single light horizontal sweep of Deus's sword, all the frozen undead were precisely cut in half. One strike. Hundreds of bodies. An overwhelming display of superhuman strength that brought hope to the eyes of the soldiers and knights. But just then, boom! With a deafening explosion, the outer god descended in the middle of the battlefield. For a moment, the movements of the undead halted, and the eyes of the soldiers shifted toward the new arrival. The sheer overwhelming presence of the outer god filled the battlefield, and even Deus and Fiola couldn't hide the tension that appeared in their eyes. As the ashen dust cleared, revealing the figure of a man, everyone held their breath. Though he wore the clothing of the barbarians, his form had transcended anything that could still be called human. His massive physique and blue skin indicated that this being had long left the bounds of humanity. And then, "Barbarian, do not defile the sins of those who do not know honor." With that, the voice of Ultholtus echoed, and the undead began to rise again. The bodies that had been shattered into pieces by Penia started to mend, fusing together like slime and regenerating their physical forms. The corpses that had been severed by Deus's sword also began to reform. In that moment, SSSHT. Fiola, who had been silent until just moments before, suddenly appeared right in front of the outer god. His sharp instinct led him to realize that the tide of the battle had shifted the moment the undead resurrected, and they could no longer secure victory. As one of the fastest master knights of Caliban, possessing the power of divine speed, he struck before Ultholtus could even react. Thunk! Fiola's sudden strike pierced Ultholtus's heart. But Only the tip of his sword had managed to penetrate. Ah! Altheltus's gaze shifted toward Fiola, filled with contempt. Barbarians know no honor. Those who do not uphold honor abandon their very existence. Furthermore, crack! They also forsake the nobility of the soul. Thud! Fiola's body, which had just been gripping the sword, collapsed to the ground. His head was no longer attached to his body. However, there is no honorable death for those who disregard all value. With these words, Fiola's headless body began to twitch and rise, convulsing as it stood up once again. Seeing this horrifying spectacle, everyone present understood the grim reality: this battle was lost. Fear spread across the soldiers' faces, and despair began to take hold on the faces of the knights and wizards alike. Even Penia and Deus, who had far surpassed the limits of ordinary humans, were not immune to this despair. In fact, they had felt it even earlier than the others. With their heightened awareness, they knew that the being before them possessed far greater power than they had anticipated. As cries of agony and despair echoed from the undead, they were consumed by hopelessness, except for one man. O mighty god of duels, Altheltus! While everyone else was sinking into despair, a single man began walking toward the giant, passing between the living and the undead. Step, step. Neither slow nor fast. In accordance with the great oath of Calgunius. The face of the man walking toward the giant remained calm, even amidst this hellish scene of despair. As if he had been through such an experience countless times. And that man? I, alone Palatio, in the name of the great oath. The Count of Palatio. Demand a duel of Babylonia. With a swirl of his wrist, Alone raised his arm, and a bracelet glowing with a deep grey light shone as he stood face to face with the giant. All eyes were focused on Count Palatio. The terrified soldiers. The despairing knights. Even Penia and Deus. The giant standing before him. The giant's expressionless eyes looked at Alone, and Alone's emotionless eyes returned the gaze. Then, SSSSS-. A smile crept across the giant's lips. Ha 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 ha. The giant's laughter echoed through the entire space as if it would crush everything. The ground shook, and the laughter was so powerful that even the dead, who sang of despair, closed their mouths. Most of the living thought the giant's sudden laughter was filled with mockery and contempt, but contrary to their thoughts. Good. Very good. Oh, noble one. The giant's laughter was filled with genuine sincerity, joy, and exhilaration. The atmosphere around the giant's body shifted. From contempt to joy, from joy to ecstasy. And then, I, Altheltus, will accept your duel under the Great Pact. At the giant's cry, the dead who sang of despair began to move in unison, forming a massive circle around Altheltus and Alone. Drip, drip. The blood that flowed from the dead soaked the ground, marking its boundary. Thus, a blood-red Colosseum was formed. In the arena of ashes decorated by bloodshed. Under the Great Pact, until the duel is over, no one may interfere with this sacred battle. As soon as the declaration was made, the bodies of the dead exploded, creating a blood-red wall. With that, a thick smile appeared on Altheltus's face. It was a clear expression of delight. However, in contrast, Alone's face remained utterly emotionless. But I want to go home. Behind his impassive face, Alone was trembling with desperate fear. No matter how many times he reminded himself, the reason Alone came to the north was to kill the outer god Altheltus standing before him. For that, Alone had prepared everything he needed to face the god ever since hearing of the god's awakening. Now all that remained was to carry it out. Yet, despite being fully prepared, Alone's mind was filled with fear from the overwhelming pressure emanating from the god, far beyond his imagination. Stay calm. Even though he had taken the elixir of exceptionality, which was supposed to stabilize his mental state, Alone barely managed to soothe his restless heart, but unlike his emotionless face, his heart began to pound uncontrollably. It wasn't just the instinctive pressure the god exuded. There was one thing that differed from his expectations. Why has the manifestation process advanced so much already? All outer gods, once they descend, take time to adapt to reality and eventually complete the process of becoming a wise god. Altheltus should have been no different. And yet, despite this, Altheltus's manifestation had progressed faster than expected. Though there should have been about a month remaining, the outer god before him was already close to becoming a complete wise god. It was clear to see. This rapid progress in manifestation was a factor Alone had not anticipated. The closer a god gets to becoming a wise god, the stronger they become. But more curious still. O noble one who bloomed amid savagery, why do you know of our pact, though you are not of this era? As Alone swallowed dryly, recalling that point, Ulfeltus questioned him. However, Alone no longer had the luxury to respond leisurely to his words. Can I do this? Countless doubts and confusion filled his mind. Ulfeltus, who had become far stronger than expected, was shaking the resolve that Alone had barely maintained with potions, but he soon shook off the negativity. From the moment he had reached this point, Alone knew there was only one path left for him to walk. As Alone sorted through his confusion and fell into silence, Ulfeltus, still in high spirits, smiled broadly and spoke. If you don't wish to speak, so be it. You have the right. Then, let us begin the sacred duel. As the giant's smile deepened, he raised his arm. The Duel of Babylonia. Ulfeltus began to step toward Alone. With each step, the ground, stained with ash and blood, echoed with noise and left footprints, yet Alone made no move. He simply stood there, waiting for the being before him. And then... thud! Even when Ulfeltus reached him with a massive sound and raised his fist, Alone remained silent, merely watching. From a distance, curious voices of the living began to rise, but Alone maintained his silence, observing the giant's actions. The reason was simple. The rules. To flee or move in this situation would violate the rules of the great Babylonian duel, which had existed in the forgotten age of gods. There were only two rules in the Babylonian duel. 1. The attacker and defender take turns, and the defender cannot move. 2. The one who requested the duel must yield the first attack. This turn-based style of duel meant that if Alone moved even a single step, the significance would be lost. Moreover, doing so would strip him of the chance to deal with the outer god before him. Without the restrictions of the duel, there would be no way for him to kill this god, who could effortlessly slaughter even master knights in a single strike. In other words, this duel was the only means for Alone to impose restrictions that would allow him to win. Fixation. Thus, the only thing Alone could do in this moment was defend. Muttering under his breath, a sphere appeared before Alone. Condensation. The condensed sphere focused on his left arm. Reinforcement. With the words muttered, the condensed energy in his left arm began to emit a deep light. Intensification. As he finished speaking and sealed the final gesture, Ulfeltus, still smiling broadly, drew back his fist. Muscles pulled back like a ballista. The gathered force began to concentrate in the drawn fist. Alone knew this technique well, because he had seen it before. With 1 second, it could shatter the ground. With 5 seconds, it could break the sky. With 10 seconds, it could overturn the world. This was the song of destruction. And then... truly impressive. Feeling great joy in following the rules of Babylonia, Ulfeltus smiled as everyone around them wore expressions of shock. Even though they didn't fully understand, they instinctively realized. The force in the outer god's hand was far from ordinary. At the very moment when everyone's gaze converged. Oh, honorable one who understands the nobility of the duel. The fist was swung. With a deafening roar, everything was swept away. The ground burst open as if its shell had shattered. The air vibrated, creating a rough explosion sound. The world within the range of his punch momentarily became a vacuum. And then... boom! Following the delayed, ear-splitting explosion, grey dust scattered in all directions. This is unbelievable. They could see it. The world, utterly obliterated, with nothing left where Ulfeltus's fist had struck. A massive cone-shaped crater formed in the ground, and the grey sky cracked open, allowing a purple sunset to cast its light over the land. Overwhelming power. As the living, who had been staring blankly at Ulfeltus standing against the sunset, began to feel a mixture of despair and awe. The Count, he's still alive. What? What do you mean? Everyone's gaze shifted toward the conical space at the murmuring of one knight. And then... unbelievable. Along with a knight's low curse, they all saw it. Count Palatio, drenched in blood, was standing up. The Count's condition was far from normal. His right arm hung limply, unable to exert any strength, and the blood pouring from his body seemed to signal that his death was drawing near. Yet, despite such circumstances, Alone stood firm, staring straight at the giant without a trace of emotion. As the lotus-shaped pendant around the Count's neck turned to ashes and vanished. The conditions have all been met. The Count's voice echoed. I invoke the oath. The ring of the arrogant one is an item that, like the oath he originally acquired, grants power in exchange for a price. The difference in the game is that the item you obtain varies depending on whether the protagonist's class is a mage or another profession. There are two other differences. One is that unlike the oath he originally used, the ring offers 4 oaths at once. The other is that, unlike the original oath, the ring's activation condition is that the wearer must be in a near-death state. Thus, all the conditions were met. He had intentionally drawn the outer god into a duel with restrictions. He had blocked out most of the pain with the potion of Levitian. He had used the one-time artifact he acquired before stopping at Caliban, the pendant of reincarnation, which ensured survival no matter how grievously injured, to withstand the god's attack. He had obsessively reinforced only his left hand, holding onto the recovery potion, to force it into his mouth. And with that, he fulfilled the conditions for the oath. I shall perform it. In the frozen moment of time, alone, having completed the oath, looked ahead. Before him stood the giant, filled with great joy, arms spread wide, unmoving. As if waiting for Alone's attack, the giant did not move an inch. Alone staggered, stretching out his unscathed left hand. It took so long to prepare the potion of Levitian, and without it, I wouldn't have even been able to stand. A reflection uttered amidst the dull pain. Even after taking the pain-suppressing potion of Levitian and forcing the highest-grade recovery potion into his mouth, Alone's body was still broken. Unless it was an elixir, his body couldn't be instantly healed. But for now, being able to lift his left hand was enough. The giant, who revered duels, had reached the pinnacle of savagery and gained honor, would neither interfere with nor avoid Alone's attack. No matter how long it took to prepare that attack. Who? As Alone watched the magical aura spiral upward from his raised hand, twisting into a vortex, he recalled the oath he had just made and smiled faintly behind his expressionless face. The nature of the oath, requiring a great sacrifice in exchange for greater power, had made his restrictions even more severe than originally planned. Ulthaltus had grown stronger due to his rapid manifestation, exceeding Alone's expectations. However, now, Alone was certain. This strike would reach the outer god. Crack! As the spiral of electricity began to twist with a bizarre sound, Alone muttered under his breath and recalled the 4 oaths. Refraction. The first oath. To twist the laws of the world when using magic on this frozen earth. Point. The second oath. To twist the laws of the world when using magic in a near-death state. Condensation. The third oath. To twist the laws of the world when facing a god with magic. Annihilation. The fourth oath. To twist the laws of the world when facing the great dual god Ulthaltus with magic. Alone looked ahead. Before him, a massive line of red lightning had formed. Thin and long. Illuminated by the purple light of the setting sun, it gleamed a deep crimson. The grey magic flowing from the bracelet on his left hand enveloped the red line of lightning like smoke. In the eyes of the knights and soldiers, Alone's figure stood against the backdrop of the sunset. In the eyes of Deus and Pena, 2 eyes appeared behind Alone, etched into the sunset. With that line of silence. As Alone murmured, a blinding white flash shot toward the smiling giant. Boom! The grey land briefly regained the appearance of a pure white snowfield.